Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. Even though I had seen these routes 100 times before, while driving my truck through the underappreciated beauty of rural Kentucky, something felt different this time. The golden glow tinted the skies, and the wind blew through the trees, carrying the laughter of children playing in nearby fields. I found myself humming a song I hadn't heard before. The day went differently than any other. I stopped a truck to get something to eat, chatted with other drivers, and continued on my route. But as the sun started to set, a strange fog rolled in. It wasn't exactly unnatural for fog to appear in these parts. I had heard an old country ballad that my dad used to sing to me when I was growing up, and it always brought back memories of home. However, this one came on almost unexpectedly. I was filling up my tank when a local approached me. He was tall, had salt and pepper hair, and had a stern expression. "Evening," he said gruffly, to which I replied, "Be careful out there tonight." He continued to eye the fog warily. "There have been some odd things going on lately, and when this fog comes in, I ask him curious questions like, people are going missing mainly, but also unexplained accidents, and mutilated animals, and no one knows what's causing it." His response made me pause. Even though despite his menacing warning ringing in my ears, I decided to exercise caution because I hadn't personally experienced any of these events. I continued traveling through the increasingly thick fog that covered the roads, and as I did so, my visibility drastically decreased, forcing me to slow down. As I made my way through the twisting country roads, I noticed what appeared to be mutilated deer carcasses in my headlights, but the fog might have obscured the details. However, the gory sight sent chills down my spine. Suddenly, I heard a terrifying guru growl that echoed through the trees. The fog swirled as though something enormous was moving inside it, and I mentally noted the quickest way out of Felton Ridge. Suddenly, a monstrous figure with dark fur and a large dog-like head blasted through the fog and crashed into the road directly in front of my truck. Before I could react, it lunged at another unfortunate deer that had wandered too close to the road. Its razor-sharp teeth and jaws ripped through the animal's flesh mercilessly, and my heart raced as adrenaline pumped through my veins. Its eyes glinted with a yellowish light that seemed devoid of any humanity. I slammed on the gas pedal in desperation to put some distance between me and this beast, but no matter how fast or far I drove, the creatures seemed to keep up with me with ease. It helped me get through the foggy night as I raced down dark country roads. As I sped around a sharp curve, I noticed an old barn off to the side of the road. It was rusting and looked abandoned. I was suddenly struck with the idea of confusing or losing this stalking menace, so I switched off my headlights and headed in its direction. After what seemed like hours of hiding, I noticed those ominous yellow eyes gleaming from the swirling fog close to where I had parked, as if they were looking for me. I'm not sure if this predator is a natural phenomenon or the result of a twisted experiment gone wrong, but one thing is certain: it's not someone you want to run into on a foggy Kentucky night or anywhere else. For that matter, I've heard tales of legendary animals wandering the countryside, but I've always dismissed them as mere campfire tales. However, after that night when those children were laughing in the fields, I couldn't ignore those folk tales as easily because I had experienced one myself. Now, I sit outside my truck window and watch those eyes, fearless or stupid, you decide. As I sat there in the abandoned barn trying to gather my thoughts, I knew I had to figure out what this monster was and why it seemed so intent on hunting me. Was it a mutated animal, At least that's how it appeared, but its intelligence and relentless pursuit suggested something else. The barn was small and smelled of. I decided to take matters into my own hands. After years of dust covering rusted farming tools, I searched the barn for anything that would help me protect myself from this hideous dog-like creature. I found an old pickaxe, which gave me a little boost of confidence as I tried to plan my next move. Slowly, I peered out of the barn and saw the creature still lurking in the fog. It must have sensed my presence and let me know. Taking a deep breath, I prepared the pickaxe and decided it was time to face this monster. I stepped out into the freezing fog outside and yelled, "Who are you?" with surprising speed. The creature stepped towards me, but stopped short, sizing me up just out of range of my weapon for a moment. It then studied me intently before speaking in a voice I never heard before. A long time ago, I was human until I foolishly experimented with dark magic. My experimentation didn't go as planned, and instead of gaining power, I became trapped in this beastly form. I couldn't help but feel sorry for the creature that was once human, but was now cursed to walk as a monster for eternity. But even though I might have some empathy for Ignatius' predicament, my main concern was how to survive. I asked carefully, keeping my pickaxe handy, and he helped me figure out a solution. Ignatius answered, making it sound like both a request and an order. "And I swear I won't hurt you or anyone else." We spent the next few days looking for any information on dark magic or this curse, while Ignatius was hiding from the curious residents of Felton Ridge. Eventually, we located a local historian who mentioned an old book that might contain the secret to reversing Ignatius' curse. Otherwise, I was desperate and saw no other choice, so I reluctantly agreed. Under the cover of darkness, we ventured out to find the book hidden in an old cemetery just outside of town. Once we had it, we discovered a ritual to reverse the curse, but it wasn't that easy. There was a significant chance that Ignatius would die if we performed the ritual incorrectly. And as reluctant as I was to take that risk, we both agreed that it was his only chance. As the tension increased with bated breaths and hearts hammering against our chests, we finished the ritual at true redemption. Would it be redemption or death for Ignatius? There was a moving silence as white light engulfed Ignatius' twisted form. After one intense evening of reciting ancient phrases and performing complex tasks outlined in the book, sweat beads formed on my brow. Ignatius promised to change his ways and use his knowledge of the dark arts only for good, never again setting foot in Felton Ridge. As for me, I returned to the road, relieved that the nightmare ordeal was over, but incredulous at what seemed impossible. He emerged from the ash restored to his human self as a sign of gratitude for saving him from his cursed existence and giving him another chance at life. Aware that I might keep looking over my shoulder on foggy nights, wondering if there were more creatures out there like Ignatius waiting to wreak havoc in someone else's life. I've always been a bit of a night owl, so the overnight shifts as a truck driver suited me just fine. My rig was my second home, and I reveled in the freedom and solitude of the open road. Ironically, it was during one such around 2 in the morning, on a particularly boring stretch of highway in southern Nevada. My radio chatter had died down, leaving only the steady hum of my engine for company. The stars above provided just enough light for me to see the surrounding desert landscape, and every now and then a tumbleweed sent some shivers down my spine. This was the kind of situation that made all those jokes about mystical creatures lurking in the woods seem less funny and more completely plausible. About 3 hours into this especially uneventful journey, something changed abruptly. I began to feel uneasy, as if I was no longer alone in my taxi. I looked around anxiously, but I couldn't find anything out of place or identify any specific source of my irrational fear as my headlights cut through despite the darkness ahead. I was determined not to let my imagination take over. I chalked it up to some off-road ATV riders having a little late-night fun and managed to laugh at myself for being so easily frightened when I caught a glimpse of what appeared to be multiple sets of erratic footprints skittering across the asphalt These footprints seemed deeply embedded and definitely human-like, but with an odd number of toes. However, even though I tried to make sense of what I had seen, the nagging feeling of unease persisted. When I pulled over at a lonesome rest area to stretch my legs and get some coffee from my thermos, a tiny solace in these endless hours of nothingness, I saw that another large rig had also parked there. The tractor-trailer appeared to be vibrating, with barely noticeable energy. Before I could even tap on the door, it flew open, revealing a dubious figure I could only characterize as pure freaking nightmare fuel. He was a tall, lanky man with an even older leather jacket and an old hat, and his skin was abnormally pale and weathered, think corned beef left in the sun, and his eyes had the predatory gleam that I've only seen in wildlife documentaries that show ravenous predators pursuing their prey. "Hey there," he drawled in a voice that sounded unnervingly gravel-throated, like rocks grinding against one another's names, surprised by his unexpected appearance, and seemed to have a deep-seated disdain, for I gave him a halting introduction, before asking if he had also noticed the strange footprints on the road. When I mentioned that, his already sinister grin only got bigger and more menacing. "Oh, you've seen him all right," he said, "because those are the tracks of the Ambler, a twisted soul that wanders these areas searching for lost souls to claim." Based on his demeanor, it was obvious that he believed what he was saying. As if on cue, the tension in the air increased as distant screams reverberated through the still night air, almost causing me to spill my priceless coffee in fear. Seemingly prompted by this tragic development, Raspin jumped back into his rig with unexpected agility and yelled at me to follow him. When I hesitated, I immediately realized that skepticism had no place here in these abandoned sands, so I just as quickly jumped back into my truck. The pursuit was underway, and the horrors lurking in the depths of that seemingly endless Nevada desert curve loomed ever closer. With Raspin's truck leading the way, we blasted down the deserted highway, chasing whatever creature had left those mysterious footprints behind. I followed his lead, praying that the unknown fate of those mysterious footprints wasn't a glimpse into our own future. As we drove on, I noticed that Raspin's truck was slowly moving away from me. His rig seemed to defy the laws of physics as it glided effortlessly, and the eerie footprints behind our headlights cast a weak glow around us, bathing the Nevada desert in an orange glow as our tires ate up mile after mile. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I wasn't over my head playing a deadly game with an opponent who knew every rule and I knew none. I made a mental note throughout the night that if we survived this ordeal, I needed to ask him about his truck's insane capabilities. Suddenly, Raspin's brakes slammed, whipping his rig around in a taiko turn, sending gravel and dust flying into the air like a miniature sandstorm. I struggled frantically with my steering wheel, but I was able to skid to a stop. He pointed to something just off to the side of the road. That poor bastard wasn't fast enough near a ditch flay, a mangle of limbs and blooded flesh that used to be a man. The sight was horrifying, and whoever this Ambler creature was showed no mercy for anyone. We both rolled down our windows, rasped, and yelled over the sounds of revving engines. "We're too late." When we were safe, he sped off down the highway again, and as we raced farther into the darkness, I couldn't stop thinking about that mutilated corpse. Eventually, we pulled over at an abandoned gas station that appeared to have been closed for decades. Raspin turned back to me and said icily, "Remember what you saw here tonight, because I'm going to explain everything once we're safe." Cigarette, as he started to describe the bizarre events of the evening. He explained that the Ambler was once a man named Gregor Fennell, who was now cast because of his deformed appearance. Years ago, some town residents decided to give Gregor one last torment. They drove him out into the desert and took turns beating him until he was barely breathing, laughing, and leaving him there by himself, and passing away to their delight. Gregor never came back to town. Instead, his hatred grew and transformed him into something more than human, a shadow that thrived on other people's suffering. An undead spirit constantly seeking out new victims to prolong its twisted existence. I stared at him in shock, unable to comprehend what he had said. But I could recall the footprints, and that we both got back into our trucks, gripping our wheels tightly with determination etched on our faces. We knew that facing the Ambler meant accepting great risks, but doing nothing seemed worse by far. What happened next would burn itself into my memory forever. We had previously seen a mutilated body. It is our duty to stop Gregor the Ambler and put an end to the suffering he causes. Dread that I could never completely tell anyone else. It wasn't until years later that I finally pieced together who the man in this terrifying tale was. Once, a gifted truck driver like me, his quest for revenge against the Ambler led him down a dark path, where he exchanged his soul for supernatural skills and knowledge. His name would never be honored as a hero in popular folklore. Instead, his legacy would be haunted and defined for all time by his infamy. It was just another dusty afternoon on Route 66 as I drove through the vast Arizona landscape with my trusty 18-wheeler carrying a full load of cargo headed for Las Vegas. I hadn't seen anyone in hours, unless you count the conversation with my feisty parrot perched on my shoulder in the driver's seat and the chrysanthemum, who dared to hunt down the horrors lurking just beyond the edge of our understanding. I laughed and took a swig from my black coffee thermos as I said, "Just you and me against the world at Chris." My quirky parents had given me the name Dahlia, Arbogast, but my trucking friends all called me Twister because I could maneuver my large rig through even the tightest spaces. I loved the freedom of the open road and never gave a damn. About an hour before sunset, I turned off onto a quiet side road for a much-needed pit stop at one of those hole-in-the-wall diners, which seemed to exist only for truckers to refuel their bodies and souls. I braced myself against a sudden gust of wind that smacked me in the face like an irate ex-girlfriend. I escorted Chris into the desert diner, a place I frequently visited, following some teasing and laughter with a few regulars relaxing in the two well-known vinyl-covered booths, and an unplanned photo shoot with Chrysanthemum in exchange for a few gummy bears offered by devoted fans. It was time to beat feet bidding. Chris and I returned to the open road with the intention of reaching our destination in record time, with truckers' pride being the powerful inspiration as the sun began to set over the desolate desert terrain. But the air became strangely tense. I had traveled this section of road innumerable times and had never felt the need to reach for my lucky rabbit foot before, but it was between my fingers before I even noticed it. Chris appeared to notice her feathers ruffling a little, and then something tiny and dark darted. I shook the feeling away and continued down the seemingly endless highway, which gradually turned into hell's own roller coaster. The pitch-black veil of night provided the kind of visibility that would make a difference. Across the road in front of me, the headlights illuminated its desperate dash, and if I hadn't known any better, I would have sworn it looked human. With every mile that went by, a thick fog rolled in like sticky cotton candy, winding around the paper cone, and all of a sudden, those same dark figures were in my headlights once more. This time, however, one of them lingered at the side of the road, long enough for me to catch a glimpse of a pale, emaciated face. But squint never eased the tension. On the contrary, it made it worse. Every instinct in my body told me that we were only a few miles away from disaster at this point, but I had no idea what kind of disaster was in store for us. Chris, whose eyes seemed to gleam red like rubies, let out an alarm and squawked right into my ear, my heart thumping in my ears like a drum corps gone feral. I flirted harder than my old best friend had ever been pushed before. Forsaken stretch, or why fate itself seemed hell-bent on aligning me with these sinister beings. As I braced myself for whatever horrors lay ahead, I chanced upon another trucker, who looked just as shaken as I felt. We locked eyes, acknowledging the mutual unspoken terror, before we both caught a glimpse of more nightmarish creatures lurking at the edge of our rapidly shrinking world. Suddenly an ear-piercing scream split. The other driver's truck was passed by the fog, with a nary a trace left behind, and I watched helplessly as tendrils of darkness snaked around it. My heart was elevated, and I was sweating coldly. and the chrysanthemum caught nervously, sensing my uneasiness. I knew I had to solve this twisted enigma, or those dark figures would haunt me for the rest of my life. Desperate for answers, I picked up the CB radio and called Hank, a friend from my trucking community who dabbled in local folklore. He got back to me almost immediately, telling me he was parked at a rest stop a few miles ahead of my location. I met up with Hank and shared the bone. He promised to help me uncover the chilling events I had witnessed, and he recommended that I go to a nearby old bar that had once been frequented by cabs and tough-as-nails miners. The bar had been there long enough that if there were any rumors about these enigmatic creatures, someone there would be aware of them. Entering the bar felt like traveling back in time, with the air hazy with layer after layer, layer after layer. We approached an elderly man sitting at the end of the bar and slowly persuaded him to join us in a talk about our uninvited guests haunting Route 66, while the smoke from cigarettes and pipe tobacco played. He told us, to our astonishment, that, decades ago, a group of miners were trapped in a cave collapse, but they did not immediately perish. After spending weeks under the debris before giving way to their terrible surroundings, their souls changed into twisted beings capable of unspeakable evil that roamed their haunting grounds at night, like spectres from Dante's Inferno. Enlightened but far from relieved, we made it our goal to rescue these tormented souls from their agony that very evening. We knew exactly what to do when Hank mentioned an ancient Navajo ceremony that was supposed to free trapped souls by giving them a means of transitioning to the afterlife. We stopped at a nearby store to get the supplies we needed, including candles, sage, and clay pots, before continuing on into the abandoned mining area under a sky so vast and dark that it seemed to engulf even our most audacious dreams. As we performed the ritual under the watchful stars above the dense fog, the heavy fog abruptly disappeared and was replaced by an unnatural wave of heat that left us gasping for air. Even as we performed the ritual, we could feel something changing in the air around us, as if those otherworldly creatures were beginning to gather in anticipation of their own salvation. The desert remained an unforgiving place, full of hardships and hidden dangers, but Route 66 itself bore no more terrors. Oddly, the manifestations had vanished, their smouldering red eyes had been permanently darkened, and we had finally brought them peace. Days had turned into weeks, weeks into months, and eventually time had softened the edges of fear that our experience had etched on our souls. Than you might find in any large city, but for me, I carried on living my life as a twister, zigzagging across the highways of America with my faithful sidekick Chrysanthemum by my side at all times. Her cozy weight on my shoulder served as evidence that, despite the appearance of something beyond our comprehension or hope for salvation, there was always one unchanging truth that we could rely on. Every mile offered another chance for redemption, and as long as I kept moving forward, Chris and I would find that road, wherever it led. I was on my way back to the depot after a long day of deliveries when I decided to pull over at a rest stop for a quick snack and to stretch my legs. Finding a trucker-friendly place was always a fun challenge, but this time I decided that now would be a good time to take a break, finding a nice little place called Mike's Truck Stop and grilled just off the interstate. It didn't seem very busy, so I grabbed a greasy cheeseburger and finished it quickly. I then went outside for some fresh air as the sun was setting, casting deep orange and purple hues across the western horizon while I was wrapping up a phone call with my wife. Felt my legs relax as I relished the moment of peace. I must take advantage of these brief pauses between runs. I recall thinking that a newspaper fluttered across the parking lot like tumbleweed, briefly grabbing my attention before vanishing. Into an open gully, the air carried a chilling chill that made me shudder, and I felt compelled to hit the road once more. I wished my wife well and made my way back to my rig. I got back into the cab of my truck, spotted something strange, an old van covered in dust, with a single headlight flickering once a week on its hood. It looked like it was from a twisted nostalgia, a trip from the 1970s, and its filthy windows blocked out any view inside. But it seemed harmless enough as it rolled out onto the highway. Once more, there was only one other car, and sure enough, it was that eerie old van keeping pace by my side. We kept going in this manner for miles, until the van started to lag behind ever so slightly before picking up speed again. With each cycle, they got closer until they were only a few inches from my side mirror. What is this guy's problem? I muttered under my breath, clutching the wheel tightly as my frustration swiftly escalated into anxiety, and I tried to outrun them. But they matched my acceleration perfectly, my skepticism vanishing. As the situation began to truly feel dangerous, suddenly a burst of static cut through the soft hum of the radio station. Had been listening to a distorted voice crackled across the waves. Nice evening for a race, and my heart raced as I realized that my scrutiny was in misplaced. Desperate to be free of this unnerving driver and regain control, I tried another burst of speed, even though I knew it wouldn't help. The van's grating laughter reverberated mockingly over the radio like a taunting shadow. Okay, the voice said. Since she doesn't want to play, here's a joke for you. What's got one broken headlight and is about to make your life miserable? Before I could comprehend what was happening, or even consider answering, something slammed into the side of my, breathing heavily as terror set in. I looked across at the van just in time to see a twisted grin staring back at me from their driver's seat. The face had no other distinguishing features, but it was seething with pure malice. I knew this was far from over, and my actions were all I could do to prevent the truck from veering dangerously off course and crashing into oncoming traffic or hurtling off the highway altogether. As we continued down this dark stretch of highway, an unknown nemesis had made its presence known, and every mile added weariness to our dance of death I was experiencing. This led to thoughts of possible plans, weighing every option and every possible escape from this relentless tormentor. But at that moment, there was no room for humour or light-heartedness, only pure, heartbreaking apprehension, as those two paths loomed before me. The horror of it all twisted tighter and tighter, entangling me in its grasp, regardless of which path I chose. This journey had undoubtedly altered everything I had previously known. And one thing was certain there, I had to choose between standing my ground and resisting the nightmare at my side, or giving in to the fear that gripped my heart. There would be no easy endings on this abandoned road to darkness, so I had no choice but to pick up the radio and respond to the mocking voice. "Who are you, and what do you want from me?" The laughter subsided and was replaced by a sly smile. "My name is Tony, but that is irrelevant. What matters is that you will play my game," I asked, my voice faltering. "What game are you going to play, Tony? I asked you a few questions." With a hint of menace, he said, "Get him right and I might let you live. We'll see how it goes." Knowing that this man was all too real and that I had no choice but to comply, I stole myself so that the strange interrogation could proceed. "All right," I replied thirstily. "Asking your first question, when was the last time you?" As I searched my mind for the answer, I couldn't remember exactly what my family had to do with our high-speed duel on this desolate highway. The eerie silence of the night was broken by the sound of speeding cars, followed by a distant cacophony of sirens. Thinking fast, I took advantage of the opportunity our approaching audience presented. "You know what?" Tony scarfed incredulously, before yailing out his next question, unaware that he had already been caught in my deception and was thrown off balance. "You're right, my last visit to see my family was only today," and I lied to clenched teeth, knowing full well that any genuine memories of them were obscured behind innumerable smiles spent hauling cargo and making late-night phone calls. Just enough for me to regain some control over this terrible track. The pursuit went on, with state troopers closing in with flashing lights that illuminated our twisted dance through the darkness. Desperation set in. We tumbled downward, wondering who would falter first. With an unstoppable sense of impending doom, I saw a shark appear ahead, possibly risking a gamble. Spell my end, I slammed the brake and swerved onto a hidden side. Rode Tony's van shot past me as confusion muddied his typically steadfast pursuit as I guided my rig along this new path. I finally regained contact with my wife through my phone. Sobbing and gasping, she relayed the terrifying news that an unhinged admirer named Tony had been stalking her for months, tracking out calls in his bizarre police lights reverberated off the trees that bordered our makeshift route, which was unfamiliar for everyone involved. We bounded down that side road in the hopes of apprehending our unseen tormentor before he escaped our grasp once. His newfound rival was fixated on me and seeking retribution with renewed urgency and insight into the twisted mind, gleefully tormenting me. More in the dark, we discovered Tony's van pulled over to the side, guns drawn. Officers came cautiously, but as they yanked open the rusty door, nobody was there. They vanished like breath on a mirror, leaving Tony and his one-eyed van tantalizingly out of reach. Although it seemed like the search for Tony would take days, it only took a few short hours. We never learned who or what Tony did that night or why he picked me as his twisted target. But his twisted game still haunts those of us who shared such horrific experiences on those dark highways, and those who relentlessly pursued him. This was before law enforcement personnel reluctantly called off their search despite their best efforts, and those of my family, who were now under round-the-clock protection. The rising sun may have brought some order and light back to the world, but its helpless rays were unable to cut through the darkness that shrouded our souls. As a result, even though Tony's evil laugh may have vanished into a disquieting memory, the scars he left behind are permanent and serve as a constant reminder that evil can lurk in even the most ordinary places in our lives. I was driving my usual truck route for Reefer Brothers, a reputable transport company. My name is Lana Griswold, and I've been driving for them for about 6 years. It pays well, and I enjoy the solitude of the night. It was one of those evenings, when the sun had already set its nightly farewell, that the sky hadn't decided whether or not to turn pitch black. On my way to my final destination in New York, this particular job took me through some rural areas of Pennsylvania. As my truck drove along the road, humming softly, I noticed something odd in my peripheral vision as I passed a dingy-looking farmhouse. Since this was farm country, it was normal to see livestock milling around, but these cattle were all huddled together by a fence. Obviously frightened by something, I pulled over to the side of the road to investigate further. The grass on one screen looked trampled and stained with something dark, and as I got closer to one of the cows, I felt a chill go down my spine when I saw that it wasn't mud, but blood on the ground. My heart was racing with anxiety, and I wanted to run away right away, but instead I found myself something had frightened them even more than it had me. When we moved closer to those wide-eyed jerky motions cows make when they are nervous, suddenly, a terrible scene emerged. One of the cows had been viciously mauled, and its guts had spilled out onto the ground like twisted spaghetti strings with meaty chunks in between. The smell of blood and decay hung heavy in the air, and I forced myself to suppress my gag reflex. Whoever or whatever did this had no idea. I backed away from this gory scene, just as an elderly man in faded overalls staggered toward me from around the corner, his face painted with fear. He stammered, "I'm Horace Chapman, and I own this farm, but I don't know how this happened. But predators out here usually avoid an entire herd like this." We spoke for a few more words, and then my boss, Carlos, yelled in my ear as I tried to contain my shaking voice as I told him what I had discovered on my cell phone. It was playing the catchy song from the movie Ghostbusters, which I had mentioned as a joke so long ago. The shrill melody of it seemed especially horrifying now, in stark contrast to the macabre scene before me. "Yolana, we've got another shipment ready for you when you get back." As we hung up, a growling gutter reverberated through the air behind me, making every hair on my body stand up. The once calm suddenly seemed sinister and dangerous. He fell silent for a moment before saying in a hushed tone, "Get out of there now. This ain't your problem. Leave it to the cops." Slowly, I turned around and saw a figure standing about 10 yards away. Horace scrambled toward his house while shouting for me to follow, realizing how helpless I was against whatever this entity was. With only a trucker-sized Leatherman multi-tool in hand, I followed suit like he did, from me, tall and hunched over. The creature's skin looked leathery and stretched over its skeletal frame, ill-fitting glove. Its face was twisted in a snail, with beady eyes reflecting the last drags of light that day had left behind. While he called 911, we hurried into Horace's farmhouse, unlocked every door and window we could find, because we were on the run from a predator and knew it couldn't handle us on its own terms. We were afraid that any sudden, violent crash or loud noise would kill us both. So we were both breathing heavily when I heard a faint echo of a familiar song in the distance, Ghostbusters. Those police sirens never seemed to come close to our location, and Ghostbusters continued to float faintly through the air outside, while the eerie melody of the Ghostbusters theme continued to play outside its location. The realization hit me like lightning, and I dropped my cell phone outside, eliminating any last vestige of false hope I had left. The creature chasing me had a way of finding me no matter where I hid. The idea of being stalked by this unidentified creature was nearly intolerable, and unrelenting persistence only made me feel worse. Horace and I hadn't left our positions inside the house since we locked everything up, and my hands were clammy and my breath was shallow. Suddenly, there was a crash from the front door, and we both jumped, our hearts thumping in our chests, followed by scratching sounds coming from the windows it was attempting to enter. Horace called for me to hide upstairs while he retrieved his old hunting rifle. I was hesitant at first, but I quickly made the decision to do as he said, and I ran up the stairs and hid under a bed in one of the bedrooms, holding a lamp as a makeshift weapon, though it wouldn't help against that thing. The scratching got louder and more desperate until it stopped suddenly, and the heavy silence filled me with dread. At that moment, I heard Horace's voice through he quickly stated in the door crack that he had discovered some old newspaper clippings about a local man, Derek Morgan, who vanished from this area years ago. While engaging in sinister rituals, he had been trying to use power from otherworldly beings to gain strength and prolong his life, but he paid a heavy price by becoming a monstrous creature. Suddenly, an ear-piercing roar echoed. I heard Horace fearlessly yelling at the creature, trying to divert it, while I stayed hidden beneath the bed. I couldn't bear to leave Horace in his hour of need, so I crawled out of my hiding place and mentally prepared myself for what was about to happen as I cautiously descended the stairs. Lamp held higher saw Horace fending off Derek, now a grotesque monster on my account, causing untold damage to the old man's home. The once human Leviathan faltered momentarily while lunging toward Horace, who fired his rifle directly into the creature's chest. A guttural howl emitted from Derek as a dark oozing substance spewed out of the wound. He stumbled backwards, and to our amazement began rapidly decomposing. I stood motionless for a moment, as my heart rate gradually returned to normal. If the shell of his humanity eventually gave way to the unnatural beast within, all that was left was a pile of blackened bones. I then swiftly got my phone from outside and called the police again, explaining that we had encountered a dangerous intruder in Horace's house, but that he was no longer a threat. However, we agreed not to discuss the gory details or the monster's origin. In the days that followed, Horace and I were able to clean up the majority of the mess that Derek's rampage had caused, but we continued living our lives, Horace caring for his farm, and me working at Reefer Brothers. Nevertheless, we would both always be troubled by the terrible things that happened in this farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania, and whenever someone inquired about it, we simply said it was something not worth discussing. Indeed, some mysteries are better left unsolved, and every now and then, as I drove through rural roads for other deliveries, or when passing by dimly lit farmhouses, I couldn't help but think of poor Derek Morgan, and how his quest for power had unleashed such unspeakable horror upon us. But now with each overpowering stench of I'm reminded of what happened that fateful night, and wonder if there were any. Other desperate men out there who sought unnatural power. I was on a particularly long haul across Texas, chugging coffee and eating sunflower seeds like my life depended on it. The road stretched out before me, and I'm always reminded of death that surprises me or curiously muffled noise that permeates my late-night drives. I was accustomed to the quiet of working alone on jobs like this, but occasionally I would catch myself daydreaming to keep my mind occupied. I would think about a random fact or recall that stupid wager I made in Vegas last year, which took me through an old factory district. It was one of those places that had been too big for its britches and went belly up after it was unable to support the companies that had once flourished in the area. Rows of abandoned warehouses and offices stood like crumbling monoliths, slowly giving way to graffiti and overgrown vegetation. The depressing heat and cracked asphalt created a melancholy atmosphere, and as I continued into the deteriorated landscape, I spotted a tall, thin figure with disheveled hair standing close to the entrance to a warehouse. Perched above their faces, they prodded something on the ground with their feet. It took me a moment to realize that they were prodding a dead coyote that was sprawled out in front of them, its limbs contorting unnaturally. Disturbed by the sight, I made the decision to stop and investigate. As I approached, the enigmatic figure looked up at me and grinned a startlingly beautiful smile in the middle of the macabre scene. I asked hesitantly, "What are you doing?" And they replied, "I'm trying to make friends," looking at the dead animal at their feet. Their eyes were so intense that I thought they might burn holes through me if we made eye contact for too long. Something about their deadpan delivery sends shivers down my spine. Before I could react, the stranger casually picked up the carcass and tossed it over their shoulder, dripping blood onto the dusty ground. "You're a truck driver?" they asked sweetly, their eyes darting between them and the knob remains of the coyote. I nodded cautiously. "Would you mind giving me a ride?" After months of exploring these abandoned buildings, I've grown lonely. Their request struck a chord with me on a deep level. Primal was disgusted by the idea, but I was also very interested in this person and their morbid hobby. My better judgment failed me, and after a few tense moments of silence, I reluctantly agreed. The stranger then walked toward my rig and threw the mangled animal into an empty before getting into the cab. We drove in silence for a while. The tension was evident as we approached an old steel mill that was gradually being overtaken by wild plants. The stranger spoke up, asking, "Did you know this place used to have so much life?" with a hint of resentment in their voice as they gazed out the window at the rundown factories. Now, it's a cemetery for both industry and animals, and their cryptic comments made me shiver once more. Who were they really? And what kind of twisted pleasure did they get from transporting dead animals? These thoughts kept me from realizing that we had ventured farther into forbidden territory, and the abandoned buildings towered over us, now casting Yuri's shadows over our path, making me feel increasingly uneasy, determined that it was time to end this ride with my enigmatic passenger. But when I looked over to tell them to go, they had already disappeared without a trace. My heart was racing as I applied the brakes and looked around, but I couldn't find them or the mutilated coyote they had taken with them. I gulped and cursed myself for not paying attention to my positive feelings earlier. Trucks slid on the cracked pavement as I slammed it into reverse and quickly fled the oppressive darkness of the rundown factory district. I didn't give a damn about the cargo. All that mattered was avoiding that weird person and their gory fascination as much as possible. A few hours later, I stopped at a diner. Because I couldn't get the unease from my unsettling experience, I struck up a conversation with a waitress named Betty. I was hesitant at first, but then I carefully brought up the strange man I had seen earlier, the man with the dead coyote. She raised an eyebrow and said, "His name is Dale, and he's been hanging around abandoned buildings, lately talking to himself. Do you know anything about his background?" Curiosity took over. Despite his morbid interests, I felt more sympathy for Dale after learning that he had worked in one of those factories before they closed. He lost his wife and daughter in a car accident and never fully recovered, she replied solemnly. As the sun set and the shadows lengthened, I sat there looking into my empty coffee cup and pondering what made Dale take that strange route. The following day, at around 3 p.m., as I was getting ready to leave town for my next haul, my curiosity overcame my caution, and I made the decision to go back to the rundown factory district once more. Even though it was daytime, the place still felt unnerving in its decayed state. After some time spent looking, I found Dale with another dead animal. When he saw me coming, a menacing smile appeared on his face near an old office building. "I didn't expect to see you again," Dale said casually as he looked at his new, deceased friend. Betty's words replayed in my mind as I tried to figure out what had happened after the accident and why I was here now. "Dale," I gently pressed for a moment, and his eyes revealed a hint of vulnerability. Without them, everything went wrong. There, Job was gone. They had no money, and all I had left were these dead creatures. He pointed to his morbid collection, saying, "They keep me company in this decaying world." My heart ached for Dale's suffering. We sat there talking as the sun started to set, and I tried to reassure him that there was still hope. As night fell, we came up with a plan to help him turn things around, and I promised to stay in touch, despite everything, though I couldn't get rid of the unsettling feeling that something beyond human comprehension in the hollow alleys of those dilapidated factories and twisted steel beams. I took a deep breath and took a step back. The spooky looks in my rearview mirror finally stopped as the distance between us grew larger years later, but I would still occasionally think of Dale, one man against an eerie backdrop of decay, trying to find peace. I hoped that whatever dark secrets were hiding behind every creeping vine and broken window would spare Dale's soul and give him the chance to find peace. Eventually vanished, much like the dead creatures he used to carry with him. In the end, our paths only crossed once, but that bittersweet bond and eerie experience remained in my memory forever, like an unsolved mystery, patiently waiting for its denouement. Reclaim his life from the shadows, even though we were able to stay in touch for a while after that encounter. I saw the small, rusted-out gas station up ahead, thinking it would be my last opportunity to get some coffee and use the restroom before setting up camp for the night. Little did I know that this pit stop would be anything but ordinary, pulling up to the old station I could use. That day, I was hauling a load across Nevada, trying to make some good time before the sun dipped below the horizon on a long stretch of highway. A lone clerk behind the dusty counter and an antiquated gas pump gave the impression that it had not been updated in years. The clerk was an odd fellow with piercing blue eyes that seemed to stare right through me as I approached, and his greasy, black hair stuck out haphazardly from under his cap, but he filled my thermos with lukewarm water. I went back outside to continue my journey after getting coffee and using the surprisingly clean restroom. As I passed the old payphone by the door, it rang, startling me. I picked it up out of instinct and hesitated before saying hello, but a gravelly voice on the other end said, "You've got quite some cargo there." I looked around anxiously and whispered back, "How do you know? Who are you looking in your side mirror?" They said menacingly, and I turned to face my rig's mirror. My heart fell when I noticed a group of men examining my semi-truck. They were scraggly-haired, rough-looking men with dirt-stained clothes, and what looked like makeshift weapons, like crowbars, tire irons, and even a sharpened garden hoe. The voice from the shadows laughed. I cautiously asked, "Do you think now what do you want?" As my thoughts were racing about how to get out, he said, "You hand them over, and nobody gets hurt," realizing that I didn't have much of an option. I told him that was fine and hung up as I got into my taxi and tried to act normal. The tires squealed and protested as a car sped into the parking lot. One of the menacing group scattered at the law enforcement site, but one of them didn't give up easily. The leader, who was dark-haired and muscular, scrambled up onto my rig and smashed open my cargo door with a sledgehammer. Two beat-up cruisers pulled up behind me, cops. The blue and red lights flashed on top of their cars, and the sirens blared, indicating that everything was still in order. The handcuffed man was being taken to one of the cruisers when I heard one of the officers radioing for backup. We got in the highway rippers, who were notorious hijackers who raided trucks along desolate sections of highway. How could I have been so reckless? Their game was over now, though. At least for this shipment. My hands trembled as I filled up and headed back on the road, acutely aware that danger was around every corner. Could there be more people like them waiting in the dark? I forced those thoughts aside, concentrating on getting to my destination without losing my cargo. But if they weren't yanking them from me today, who's to say they wouldn't try again? Another time, after that run-in with the highway robbers, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that my life would never be the same. For the next few days, I was nervous and jumped at every creak and rustle. I also began to notice things I had never noticed before, like the glint of a broken glass shard on the side of the road and a faded Watch for Hijackers sign that was barely visible in the underbrush. I overheard a couple of customers discussing a hijacking that occurred in Utah last week while I was stopping by a diner for breakfast one morning. It was the same memo that had happened to me, thugs raiding cargo trucks. I couldn't help but share my own story with them. We started talking, and Jake, one of them, mentioned that he had been researching highway hijackings after a friend's truck was struck last month. Given that Jake had learned some fascinating facts about the highway robbers' leader, Baxter Kane, an ex-con with nothing to lose after his wife abandoned him and took their daughter away, he became vengeful and took what he wanted from people, going about their lives because his own happiness had been stolen. Armed with this information, I felt more determined to stay safe and ensure that no one more person was taken by these criminals, and I wouldn't see them again until 3 nights later at a truck stop. As I got out of my taxi to get coffee and stretch my legs, I saw a pickup truck parked suspiciously close by. The men inside were avoiding eye contact, but something about their faces and mannerisms shouted danger, and my heart raced, casually turning the corner as if heading to the restroom. I reached for the handgun I'd been carrying since the first encounter because I didn't want any trouble, but I needed to be ready if things went south. I took out my phone and dialed 911, and as soon as the dispatcher answered, I whispered urgently about a possible hijacking at the truck stop, mentioning Baxter Kane and the highway robbers. Within minutes, police cars arrived. This time, however, Baxter was caught handcuffed and taken away with his goons. Although I didn't speak to him directly, there was no mistaking the menace in his eyes as he stared me down, knowing that I had played a crucial role in their capture. Sirens blaring, the disheveled men in the pickup scurried for their weapons, but they were no match for the composed and prepared officers. He knew who brought him down, which was important to me because, now that Baxter was in jail, I was kind of a hero to the truckers on that section of the highway. Although my life has mostly returned to normal, the memory of that dangerous incident still haunts me every mile I drive. It weighs heavily on me because I know that even when one group has stopped, others might still be hiding. When my truck's radio suddenly came to life for the first time in hours, I was transporting a load of canned goods from California to Utah at around 3:15 in the morning. The road ahead appeared to be an endless black ribbon slicing through the night. I considered waiting for the sun to rise, but then I remembered that I needed every minute to meet my deadline. The anonymous speaker on the radio's tone was both mocking and menacing. "Hey, cut it out," I replied casually, but sharply. Not really in the mood for ghost stories or pranks. An hour later, I decided to take a quick break at a rest stop off the highway because this particular spot is so remote. You know what they say about truckers who drive through here late at night? They say they'll catch a glimpse of something strange that makes their skin crawl. As I stepped out of my rig to stretch my legs, I noticed something in the distance, that caught my attention. Squinting into the darkness, I could barely make out some sort of movement in the sparse forest beyond. I assumed it must be just a deer or something similar, and I started walking back toward my truck when I heard what sounded like footsteps behind me, but they weren't quite human. I wasn't surprised to see no other cars or trucks there either. The beam of light pierces the night sky, searching for its source, and I instantly realized that these footsteps were normal to big and heavy, as if they were made by someone wearing boots. But who would be out here at this hour dressed like that? Then, as quickly as it had begun, the sound stopped. Feeling uneasy, I grabbed my flashlight to investigate whatever was lurking there, hoping it wasn't someone with bad intentions. Once again, I found myself alone in that oppressive void of shadows and unanswered questions, with curiosity pushing me deeper into the woods like a moth drawn to a flame. As I ventured farther in my flashlight, "You there? Who are you?" I called out, my voice betraying an unusual wavering edge, but nothing came of it. Revealed something that made me stop cold, a scrawl on a nearby tree trunk with recognizable crimson red stains. The sight made my stomach turn, and I couldn't stop the bow from rising at the back of my throat. "All right, enough games," I yelled, sounding both menacing and reassuring, and then I heard a low but guttural growl. My eyes widened as they turned to face the source of the sound, which came from behind me. 10 feet away, I saw a huge, shadow-covered figure with limbs that appeared twisted in a monstrous shape that was unlike anything I had ever seen. My fingers were unsteady on the flashlight grip, so I attempted to keep the creature lit, while maintaining as I tried to think clearly and keep the flashlight steady, while every single cell in my body screamed for me to flee again. My legs felt like lead betraying me by refusing to follow my most primal instinct. My heart pounded in my chest, and the adrenaline was pumping through my veins. The growls escalated to snarls and shrieks. However, a primal urge inside of me told me to do something, because I knew I couldn't remain motionless any longer. Rather than running, I made the snap decision to face whatever it was. After taking a deep breath to regain my composure, I approached the creature carefully and asked, "Who are you?" With more force than before establishing my presence, the beast startled me by speaking in a language I could not understand, a grinding clatter of gutter growls and clicks, but despite its apparently incomprehensible speech, a feeling of dread overcame me. It was like being trapped in a nightmare from which I could not escape. So almost instinctively, I reached for my pocket knife and flicked it open. This was all I could do to protect myself from whatever was in front of me. I tried to prepare for what might happen next, but the creature's growling stopped suddenly as it moved from the shadows into the dim beams of light from my flashlight. Its face twisted into a hideous shape as it dragged an elongated finger across its throat and mimicked my voice as though it had been studying me, hissing at me in perfect mimicry before continuing with a series of guttural clicks and howls. The creature's name thundered into my mind like a powerful drum at your neck. Hearing that name reminded me of scary old folk tales that wolfen whispered in hushed tones around campfires, about creatures hiding deep within deserted woods waiting for unsuspecting travelers to venture too far away from the safety of their homes. I couldn't believe what was happening, but if Neck was real and standing right in front of me, I had to find a way to survive. The creature circled around me, its intelligent eyes watching every move I made, moving with surprising speed. It lunged towards me with outstretched claws. I screamed as loudly as my cracked voice would allow. "I won't let you kill me or anyone else." I held up my knife, threatening to steel myself for the next attack, and it stared at me with its malevolent gaze as if weighing its options. With a rush of adrenaline, I was able to slash out at it, catching it on the arm and releasing an ear-splitting scream of pain. I wasted no time in running back to my truck, locking myself inside, and stepping on the accelerator as my heart pounded wildly in terror. The entire terrifying experience couldn't have lasted more than 15 minutes, but it felt like an eternity once I had put enough distance between myself and that rest stop. The creature then suddenly fled back into the darkness, like a phantom. I knew I'd been given a rare second chance, and it seemed like Acharnak was happy to leave me alone, whether out of fear or something more cunning that made them think I wasn't worthy prey. Skimming past cargo barons and gliding along interstates became my new normal as I continued trucking between states, exhausted and haunted by the horrific encounter that somehow had left me unscathed. The irony was not lost on me, but I now knew better than to ignore the stories and warnings. No, I never ventured far from the well-travelled roads again, and I spent the remainder of my days as a trucker with a persistent worrying about what other mysteries might be out there. The radio crackled to life once more during one of those long hours. At a truck stop diner just outside of Peoria, Illinois, I was going about my business, browsing through my phone, when I noticed a news alert about 3 small-town murders. The graphic details piqued my interest, so I clicked the link and started reading. Ancient horrors lurked in the shadowy corners of the world, just waiting to be discovered. I've been a truck driver for almost 20 years, and I've seen a lot of things on the road that would make your skin crawl, but this story made me feel sick. The murders were brutal and unimaginable, and the details were detailed enough to make someone seriously think twice about turning off their porch light at night. My name is Arlen Lockhart, and I watched a fellow truckers, Waylon. I asked them if they had heard about the triple homicide story after Marius and I joked about who could eat faster without throwing up. Neither of them had. Waylon squinting at my phone screen as I showed them the graphic details. "Man, that's some messed up stuff," he said with a shudder, and Marius simply shook his head in shock. Even though we joked after talking about the graphic news, something about that story stayed with me as we said our goodbyes and left the diner. The night was dark and heavy as I got into my rig and got comfortable behind the wheel. "You think it's some serial killer on the loose around here?" I asked. "No, it's got to be a one-off thing," Marius replied before we headed towards an open booth with Waylon. As I drove through the deserted streets of Peoria towards an isolated warehouse where I was supposed to make a delivery, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something worse was out there than we knew. The sense of dread made the area even more eerie because it was deserted. I parked my rig at the warehouse and walked towards the entrance, taking in the dilapidated buildings surrounding the area. It was oddly quiet, which made me I felt uneasy and started to think that perhaps we were dismissing the possibility that there might be a serial killer on the loose too much. Then I heard footsteps behind me, so I turned around and shone my flashlight to try to light up whoever or whatever was hiding in the shadows. To my relief and embarrassment, I laughed and shook my head at myself, realizing that it was just a stray cat darting across the empty parking lot. I muttered to myself, "Damn it, Arlen, get a grip," but as I turned back to face the warehouse door, I noticed a figure standing on the other side of the chain-link fence separating the lot from a nearby field. The figure was hunched over and covered in darkness. Adrenaline shot through me, causing my hands to shake voluntarily as I tightened my hold on my flashlight. Ignoring my brain's warning not to engage, I cautiously stepped forward and called out, "Hey, who are you?" In a voice that wavered between fear and confidence. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it straightened up and moved into the dim light of a nearby street light. Then I noticed a twisted grin that stretched impossibly wide across their blood-stained face, and every instinct told me to flee. I stumbled as the figure started to slowly approach the fence, getting closer and closer. I couldn't believe my eyes, but this person's facial features were grotesque and distorted, and their expression was twisted with rage. This person couldn't be an ordinary person. It had to be some sort of monster. My legs wouldn't move. They felt like they were rooted in concrete. The blood on their faces made it obvious that they were involved in the triple homicide that had been reported earlier. Despite my crippling fear, my heart was pounding and I was unable to think clearly because I knew I had to find out who this person was, where they were from, and why they were terrorizing this small town. using what little courage I still had. I nervously raised my voice once more. Before I could react or ask any more questions, the terrifying figure turned and started to walk away into the night's darkness. I could hardly make out their silhouette as it vanished from view. "What do you want?" The figure stopped at the fence, their icy smile never leaving their face, and their voice was a guru growl like they hadn't spoken in years. After this nerve-wracking pursuit through dim alleyways and eerily quiet streets, I finally realized that this monster wasn't just any random psychopath, taking lives for thrill or gory satisfaction. Despite my deep fear of this encounter, some sort of reckless curiosity drove me to follow them from a safe distance in the hopes that perhaps the knowledge I gained would help put an end to these gruesome murders that had terrified so many innocent people. I watched as they solemnly approached what was left of a wooden door hanging lifelessly on its hinges and pushed it aside, revealing a dimly lit room within. We entered a cul-de-sac where only a few dilapidated houses stood, and the figure stopped in front of one that had unimaginably seen worse days than its neighbors. It looked as though one stiff breeze would cause it to crumble to pieces before our eyes. In a final act of carelessness, I mustered my last remaining strength and followed them there, scattering the dirty floor with pictures and relics from years ago, along with newspaper clippings that told the heartbreaking tale of a local man who lost his wife and 2 kids in a fire. Their burned remains were never found. It gradually became too evident to me who this monstrous figure was: a deranged man whose life had been shattered by loss and despair. His sanity had been consumed by pain and anguish. The fire had turned his once loving soul into a vengeful fury. I knew that the only way I could guarantee that this tormented man would stop taking other people's lives was to find a way to give him closure so that he could find peace. Armed with this piece of fun nostalgia, I approached him and held out a photograph of him with his family, beaming with happiness at some long-forgotten moment in time. I asked him gently, "Your family, would they want you to keep hurting innocent people like this?" His eyes widened as he gazed at the photograph, full of disbelief, and a range of emotions flickered over his face. I kept reaching out to the grieving man over time by learning more about him beyond his newfound monstrous nature, who he was. He first let out a heartbreaking sob that filled the dilapidated room in that moment, supported by genuine emotion from both of us. A connection was formed between us, just a broken souls trying to survive in a wicked world. Although Thomas Whitmore had a dark past and the consequences of his actions could never be erased or forgotten, he was able to rediscover some humanity within himself. He then confessed to the authorities and revealed the gory details of his crimes, providing comfort to the grieving families of those he had wronged. This made it possible for us to both gradually heal each other's broken spirits one day at a time. As a truck driver, I've always had a knack for finding the most obscure dive bars. There's something alluring about a gritty hole in the wall where I can grab a beer and a drink. They say forgiveness is a powerful thing, not just for those receiving it, but for those giving it as well. We both had a long road to recovery, though. On this particular day, I found myself at the Rusty Pelican, which was appropriate considering its location on the Florida Gulf Coast. As soon as I sat down at the bar, an older man approached me, introduced himself as Silas Brackley, and started telling me story after story about his youth and his time there. As night fell and the crowd thinned out, we both realized we'd been drinking longer than planned. Silas suggested we go to the beach and smoke a joint to end the night, figuring it was harmless enough. I agreed, and the beach was dark and empty when we did so. Working on shrimp boats could have been annoying, but there was something charming about him. Arrived with just the right amount of moonlight to cast eerie shadows across the sand dunes. We lit up our shared joint and relaxed against the log we both settled in. Silas then started telling me another story, one that had been bothering him for years. I don't like to talk about it, but there was this one summer when things got really ugly around here, and I was taken aback by his suddenly serious tone. tone I changed my focus from the black expanse of the ocean to him and asked him what had happened. He said, "Well," then paused for a second before continuing. "It began with Luigi Calavito, whose name made me shudder. Leaves you were a good guy," Silas said. "A bit of a wild child. Sure, I knew him from the docks he worked on a boat nearby that summer." But as Silas talked, the wind increased and I noticed a noticeable chill in the air that wasn't there before. It was just that stuff. Bar fights getting out of hand. More break-ins than normal. But then Silas paused and took a deep breath before bodies started to appear. One night at the Rusty Pelican, Luigi had had too many drinks. It was late, and only a few regulars remained. He began babbling about seeing things, saying he'd seen something out on the water that didn't look human. I shivered again and leaned in closer as Silas went on. Mutilated like animals had torn them apart. I unconsciously looked around us at the dark beach in the nearby ocean, but I saw nothing out of place, and no one believed him. Silas went on, a thought he snapped after years of hard living. It was tall and lanky, with chalky white skin, and these long fingers that stretched almost to the ground. He claimed that it had eyes as black as coal, and a grin that stretched impossibly wide across its face. However, shooting began near docks as if people were defending themselves against something that lurked in the shadows. We sat silently, for a while, telling each other about these gory events. "Do you know what happened to Luigi Silas?" He shook his head solemnly, and one day vanished without a word. No one ever saw him or that creature again. But in that moment, something caught my attention. I whispered, barely able to get the word out of my mouth, "Silas," as a figure in the distance emerged from the surf onto the beach, tall, dripping wet with long-reaching fingers. As our gazes met, a thrill of terror passed over me, and Silas paled next to me, frozen with fear in those last few seconds. I knew we had to move quickly as we peered at the creature, and I was positive Luigi Calavito hadn't been lying. I cried, bolting away from the log and dragging him with me. "Where do we go?" Over the sound of crushing waves, and Silas replied, "My truck. We can try to outrun it." Feeling the hot sand beneath our feet and the creature's ferocious intent following us, we ran across the beach without daring to turn around. When we arrived at my truck, I fumbled with my keys and quickly unlocked it, and we jumped in. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, and with tires scratching the gravel, we veered onto the... My headlights were shining in an old timber-bed house with paint peeling off the walls. The town historian lived there, an elderly woman who kept records of local folklore. When I knocked on her door, she sensed our urgency and invited us in without asking. I nodded in agreement as everything started to fall apart around Luigi Calavito. Silas explained our encounter with the creature and mentioned Luigi Calavito's disappearance years ago. Her eyes narrowed as she recalled the terrifying stories. She took a ragged book from a dusty shelf titled Legends of the Gulf Coast and began flipping through its pages. As she led us to a room filled with historical texts and newspapers, the faint smell of old books filled her home. According to local folklore, an ancient creature known as Kodokos rose from the sea to feast on the fear and lives of those it encountered. "What happened to Luigi," she said solemnly, "was no coincidence. He didn't just see Kodokos, he became the monster." Her words caused the room to grow cold, as if the air itself knew the grim in the shadow of an approaching storm. We were able to get everyone together at a local bar. No one seemed excited about facing Kodokos, but everyone realized that banding together gave us a better chance of survival. Our world has been forever changed since that night on the beach. We thanked her and left eager to share what we've learned with the remaining townspeople. On a hot, sweltering summer day, I made the impulsive decision to take a road trip to the Redwoods National Forest in Northern California. I had always wanted to get a close-up look at those magnificent giants since I was a child, and as long as Kodokos, or rather Luigi Calavito, one of our own haunted our town, life would never be the same. My name is Alara Killingsworth by the way. and I was a long-haul truck driver at the time, hauling timber out of Crescent City. My trip began calmly as I drove through winding roads while listening to my favorite rock songs on the radio. As I drove, I came across this small, dilapidated diner with an old neon sign flickering, and I was so hungry that I couldn't resist the urge to grab something to eat. When I entered, the place was packed. When I sat down at the counter, next to a shabby old fisherman, Jedediah Rutherford, who had one of those names too, and munched on a tasteless burger and some overcooked fries, I immediately felt like an outsider as the locals talked loudly about their everyday lives. For some reason, every conversation seemed to center on a man named Barton McAvoy. If you can picture the child of Charles Manson and Buffalo Bill from The Silence of the Lambs, Barton seems to fit that description. There are countless tales about him, ranging from young children who mysteriously disappeared while camping close to his territory to hunters who inadvertently wandered onto his land and never came back. However, to be honest, even with Jedediah's vivid descriptions of, I didn't pay much attention to McAvoy's demented adventures at first because, after all, these kinds of stories were typically just exaggerated local superstitions. But as they continued to recount horrific incidents involving this man, my curiosity began to grow. Little did I know how drastically my life would change as a result of that conversation, and 2 weeks into my transport job, I found myself pulling over at a truck stop. The eerie stories that the locals had been whispering along the dirt road that led to Barton McAvoy's supposed hiding place had become so ingrained in my mind that I couldn't resist taking a detour to check them out for guilty pleasure. Looking back, I can say that this was a terrible decision. I saw new, worn-out tracks crossing mine, which was strange because I was the only person supposed to be here. However, thrill seekers came in all shapes and sizes, so I chose to ignore the tracks and continued on, only to discover an abandoned Ford F-150 halfway in the bushes. As I looked more closely at the truck, everything seemed uncannily familiar. The dread in the pit of my stomach that Jedediah had mentioned about a local truck that vanished not long ago suddenly turned into full-blown goosebumps as my immediate surroundings took on a sinister edge. Panicked and desperate to flee a situation that was rapidly getting out of control, I turned around and ran back toward my own rig, but as fate would have it, it wasn't far away. Barton McAvoy himself was standing above me, a deranged smile stretching across his scarred and mutilated face. In one hand, he held a serrated hunting knife stained with what I could only imagine. I had just spotted old man Rutherford's battered Ford F-150 when I suddenly collided with something big and soft, or rather, someone falling over backwards against an old pile of rusty car parts. The other hand, which I assumed was blood, reached down toward me with malicious intent. Time seemed to slow down as my adrenaline-fueled brain desperately tried to come up with a plan for survival. Know this, friends, the situation had just gotten out of control, and as Barton's hand drew closer and closer to my throat, there was nothing left to do but respond instinctively. I grabbed my jeans pocket knife and slashed it at Barton's outstretched hand, drawing blood and making him take a step back. The pain seemed to make him even more angry, and he lunged at me with his serrated hunting knife. I yelled at him in an attempt to divert his attention, but his eyes narrowed as he realized that maybe I wasn't just another unfortunate victim. It was enough for me to swiftly return to on my feet. The embodiment of your nightmares snarled and glared at me. Now that you're dead, we circled each other, each searching for a chance to attack. But then we heard a rustle and a group of people staggered into this sinister clearing. It was Jedediah Rutherford and a motley crew of local men with flashlights and guns. I knew you would follow this path, Alaric, Jedediah yelled. I never thought you'd come face to face with the devil himself. Barton glared at the group, recognizing that he was now outnumbered and cornered. Jedediah fixed the monstrous man with his eyes and demanded an explanation. Your reign of terror ends tonight, Jedediah said defiantly. Barton retreated into a rundown cabin that seemed to be practically part of the forest itself. We hesitated before pursuing him because it was his territory, but we knew we couldn't let him escape, as that we had cornered him. The interior smelled musty, with rotting wood in damp soil. Odds before slightly disarming one of them and making an erratic dash through the US, stabbing one of the locals in the arm in the process. The walls were covered in torn newspaper, articles and crude drawings of violence that provided a gory glimpse into this man's mind. As we searched the cabin, I discovered a treasure trove of personal items and trinkets, and that's when it dawned on me that Barton wasn't just some random crazy person terrorizing this area. Rather, he was an insane collector who treated his victims like trophies. I told Jedediah what I had discovered, and he shared his suspicions that Barton had been abused as a child and had eventually become consumed by hatred and madness. The town had attempted to help him multiple times in the past, but he was unreachable. As we were looking for him in the cabin, we heard a heart-stopping yell coming from outside. So we hurried outside to find one of our own impaled on a booby trap, Spike dying horribly in front of our eyes. He knows these woods better than any of us, so it became painfully clear that this was not just about catching Barton McAvoy, but also about surviving this deadly game he had set up for us. We stayed together as a group, hearts pounding as we forged through the dense forest finally after hours of searching and worrying. Dang it, he's leading us on, Jedediah cursed as we started to catch our breath. Following a number of near misses, we saw Barton sprinting across an ancient, flimsy bridge that crossed the rapids below. Determined to put an end to this nightmare, once and for all, I broke away from the group and ran after him. At the halfway point of the bridge, I tackled Barton to the rotting wooden boards. Just as our posse caught up to us, he retaliated fiercely, but was eventually restrained by multiple men. As I walked away from the group, I looked back one last time and shuddered to think how close we came to becoming victims ourselves. Was it bravery or foolishness that led us down this path? Some questions may never be answered. While Jedediah tied his hands and feet, Barton McAvoy's reign of terror was finally over, and we dragged him back towards town to face justice for his crimes alive, but forever stripped of the darkness that had called to him all his life. However, for the time being, the town could begin to mend and recover from the wounds caused by Barton McAvoy and his gory collection. It had been a long day on the road as I drove my truck through West Virginia's wintry backwoods after delivering a shipment to a distant warehouse. As I made my way back to the main highway, I could hear the crackling sounds of an I'm Eldon Rayford, and I've been driving big rigs for almost 20 years. I'm a husband and father, and my passengers are typically just 4 wheels and the cargo hold full of goods. I heard some classic rock songs on an old AM radio station, and even though I had heard them countless times before, there was something calming about the guitar riffs mixed with the hum of my reliable engine. This trip, however, was anything but ordinary. As I turned onto a narrow gravel road that led to the pickup location, I saw 3 strangers in a dilapidated van parked by the side of the road. They all appeared to be living day to day, and I could tell something wasn't right. At that moment, one of them called out mockingly as he got close to my window. I hesitated for a moment, knowing that this was really none of my business, but their suspicious manner piqued my curiosity. "What's going on?" I asked cautiously, "Just having a bit of car trouble," and he replied nervously, "Can you give us a hand getting back on our feet?" There seemed to be something strange about this guy. As I had suspected from the start, these people were up to no good, and before I knew it, they had surrounded me. Or perhaps it was his 2 friends who stood silently nearby, their eyes darting back and forth in a predatory manner. We continued talking for a few more minutes as they explained that they needed help fixing their vehicle, but that all of their tools were locked inside. At the time, it didn't make much sense to me. I grudgingly complied throughout the entire ordeal, but as we drove deeper into the woods, I couldn't help but notice a series of gory scars that ran down the arms and necks of all three captors. It was truly horrifying, like something out of a true crime story or a snuff film, and it made me wonder just what kind of twisted monsters I was dealing with. Worried about whether I would ever make it out of this terrible nightmare alive, I would occasionally catch a glimpse of mutilated limbs and other body parts scattered throughout the heavily forested area, which gave me the chills. Eventually, we came to a stop at a derelict shack tucked away among the thicket of trees. The place looked eerily deserted, with windows beyond repair and walls pocked with bullet holes. My mind was racing with innumerable terrifying ideas about what was happening inside that godforsaken building. Before long, my captors marched me to the building's dilapidated front entrance, their sinister intentions growing more apparent by the moment. Just as we were ready to enter, I slipped out of their grasp, surprising them with using all of my remaining strength. I zigzagged through the wooded area for what felt like hours as the captors chased after me, screaming and swearing in frustration. One evening at dusk, I stumbled upon a small creek and decided to follow it in the hopes that it might lead me to some sign of civilization. The sun was setting quickly when I noticed, when I looked more closely, I saw that there was a seemingly deserted campsite close by. I was tired and in need of shelter, so I started to head for the makeshift home when I noticed something strange. A collection of loosely collected photos, most of which were Polaroids or old newspaper clippings, was pinned up against one of the tents. Almost every surface looked to be stained with blood. There was no question that the perpetrator of these violent crimes had now set up camp here. But who were they working with? I began looking for any personal items they might have left behind in an effort to identify them, and in one of the tents I discovered a knife with an insignia on its hilt that said it belonged to DJ, which must have been over the next few days. I continued scavenging through the woods until I came across a rundown house off the beaten path. I approached cautiously, taking note of every detail that might give me information about my attacker and how they were connected to this house. It wasn't much, but at least it gave me some clues about who this person could be managing to evade my captors. The house was filled with old newspapers and other sentimental items that demonstrated the deeply disturbed mind that had occupied this space. It was late in the evening by the time I entered through the creaky front door, and the smell of decay overcame me. As I ventured further inside, I found a room full of unsettlingly detailed sketches and plans that seemed to depict my captors' violent acts. My heart raced as I browsed the pictures, but at last one in particular drew my eye, a sketch of my captor with the initials DJ. It was chilling to realize that Dennis Johnson, an old friend from trucking school, had always been a little off the deep end, and we had lost contact over the years, and the connection suddenly made sense. Must have found me via our shared professional connections. After further searching the house, I was able to locate a functional landline phone and dial 911. When the police arrived, they immediately started a manhunt for Dennis to bring him to justice for his evil deeds. But Dennis was never apprehended or killed during the manhunt. Instead, his grueling reign of terror came to an end when he appeared to disappear without a trace. I still work as a truck driver today, but instead of relying only on my guitar riffs and the hum of the engines for comfort, my eyes are always open, seeking some sort of closure or indication that justice will one day be served. The horrific experiences I had at Dennis' hands left me permanently altered, alert, and wary of my surroundings. On a moonless night, I was driving my rig in rural Utah in an attempt to reach a truck stop before my shift ended. There weren't many trucks or cars on this particular stretch of road, which I always found to be peaceful. It was one of those nights when the silence seemed pleasant and inviting. On nights like this, I usually have time to think about random things and make jokes, or sing off-key songs. As I turned a corner in the road, I noticed what appeared to be a stalled car slowing down. I saw that it was an old, dilapidated station wagon parked carelessly on the shoulder, and a man was hunched over the open hood, obviously trying to fix whatever was wrong. He looked desperate and frustrated, So I opened my taxi door and yelled, "Hey, you need a hand?" He looked up in a moment of surprise, then nodded hesitantly, "Yeah, if you don't mind." Figuring this wouldn't take long given my mechanical prowess, I grabbed my toolbox and strolled over up close, and the man appeared worn out. His clothes were filthy and stained with sweat. He introduced himself as Keston Bleeker, and we talked briefly about the Queen's small town, where he grew up. He told me that his family's farm had been struggling for years because of droughts and dwindling markets. As we dug into the engine's quirks, I noticed that despite his frazzled demeanor, Keston had a nasty habit of nervously biting his nails whenever he spoke, made a few jokes that helped lighten the mood of what would have been a gloomy night. As we were finishing up our repairs, I heard footsteps coming from the shadows, and when I turned around, I saw two more people coming out of the shadows. Their faces briefly brightened as they entered the light from my rig's headlights. They identified themselves as Rick and Mallory, and they claimed to be siblings who were Keston's friends who had been waiting close by for him. They thanked me a lot for helping Keston, and Rick even offered me some moonshine, which I politely declined. However, something about their behavior unnerved me, as if they were making an effort to be friendly despite my growing opposition. I assured them that there was no issue and offered to drive them back to their cars, since it was obvious that Keston would need assistance. Reluctantly, they agreed to haul his car away, and we all climbed into my truck as we headed into town. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that those two had ulterior intentions, hiding behind their glassy stares, and their conversations felt stilted and uncomfortable, not at all like the relaxed banter you'd expect from close friends or siblings. A few miles later, Keston instructed me to stop at a rundown old barn, just off glass shards from the broken moonshine bottle glinting dangerously in Mallory's hand. As she suddenly lunged at me with manic fervor, my reflexes kicked in, and I was able to push her away just in time, and I scrambled out of the truck with my heart racing wildly as adrenaline coursed through my veins. Keston, Rick and Mallory had sprung out too, yelling and cursing at each other like madmen in coherent chaos just before in the heat of the moment. I could only speculate as to what sinister pursuits brought this insane trio to my small corner of the world at night, and in a panic, I hurried back into my taxi. They were fighting fiercely and ferociously among themselves, and it became evident that their goals were far darker than fixing a broken down car or assisting a grateful driver in finding his way. I couldn't help but think about how three seemingly random people managed to terrify me to my core. I barreled down the dark, desolate highway, floored the accelerator, leaving them in a cloud of dust and confusion. It was a terrifying experience that I would never fully escape from after that night, and I couldn't get those unsettling faces out of my head. A few days later, while stopping at a local diner for coffee and pie, I overheard rumors of a string of robberies and murders spanning several counties. My curiosity piqued, so I started asking around for more information. I met an old mechanic named Yep, who seemed to know all the local gossip. Rick, Mallory and Keston's twisted intentions haunted me as I continued driving along desolate highways. He told me about a family that terrorized the area, the Bleekers being devil spawn, while smoking a cigarette outside the shop where he tinkered with old vehicles. He claimed that it began with Keston's father, Emmett, who was married to his own sister, Josie, and the two of them gave birth to the insane group that we now know as Keston, Rick and Mallory. As the story progressed, it became evident that Keston, Rick and Mallory were siblings who were bonded by their traumatic upbringing and the result of an incestuous relationship. Their violent behavior had led to many crimes and acts of terror in this area. But why had they picked me? The answer came when Yep said that they had a grudge against truck drivers in particular, blaming them for denying them honest work because people weren't buying it, their belongings from small farmers like they used to. This realization rocked me to my core because I knew that these insane people were targeting truckers because of deep-rooted hatred and because of my line of work, which is motivated by fear and the need for closure. I became their marked enemy. I called the local sheriff's office to report them after gathering as much information as I could about the Bleakers' hideout from Yep. After giving Yep all the information I had learned and describing my own experience, they made a horrifying discovery. The rundown barn they had been using as a hideout was filled with stolen trucking equipment and human remains. What was even more horrifying was the discovery of multiple torture chambers used to brutally end the lives of truckers hidden deep within the barn. The horror of my brief encounter was multiplied tenfold when pictures of though I knew the Bleakers were in custody. The nightmare was far from over. The cold-blooded trio would always lurk in the darkest recesses of my mind, and my nights on lonely stretches of road turned into living dread, knowing that the atrocities that awaited me that fateful night were revealed. Somehow, I had managed to escape the gruesome fate that these twisted siblings had planned for me and countless others like me. There may be other vicious families like them, but life had to go on. And even though I would never completely forget my near-death experience, I eventually moved on as a truck driver, and the open roads continued to serve as both my office and my sanctuary. However, years after life, as I knew it changed into legend, I heard rumours of terrible crimes among my since that night with Keston Bleeker and his unholy siblings. Every breakdown or stalled vehicle seemed like an ominous echo, waiting for me just around the bend, permanently marring any journey. Truckers' tales, as their fellow drivers called them, were a painful reminder of what I'd survived, as well as the dark truth festering behind severed family bonds. As for Keston Bleeker and his siblings Rick and Mallory, their reigns came to an end when justice finally caught up with them. They are currently each in solitary confinement, and the only comfort I can find is that their cruelty confines them as far off faces of evil that haunt my dreams even though I persevere. It was a long day as usual, and I was enjoying the cool breeze on my face while driving down a desolate stretch of Highway 81 in Nebraska. I had been a truck driver for about 10 years, but I had never experienced the carefree joy I once took for granted on those open roads. The price for my survival was the unwavering knowledge of the darkness that lurks in this world. I'm Elwood Preston, and while my life as a truck driver hasn't been particularly exciting, it has paid the bills. My wife Matilda used to joke that she married me because of my sense of humour, which had helped us get through some difficult times. We have two lovely children, Morgan and Claudia, but being away from them for so long has been difficult. In any case, on this particular night, I was about halfway to my destination to drop off a cargo shipment when the radio in the truck played nothing but static on this stretch of highway because reception wasn't great out here. Up ahead, I noticed a parked car with its radio turned off. Long hours can be difficult, but it's always a blessing when a job takes me to local heavy loads, so I can spend some extra time with my family. When the hazard lights began to blink, I initially assumed it might be someone having engine problems or perhaps an empty car that had been abandoned by its owner because of a lack of fuel. However, as I got closer, I realized that something odd was happening. A man was standing next to the car, frantically waving his arms to get my attention. From what I could see in the dim light from a distance, he looked bloody and bruised. I cautiously slowed down my truck, and when I rolled down the window to ask him if he needed help, he cried out through tears, "My wife is in the car unconscious and in a lot of pain. Could you please call an ambulance?" I instantly grabbed my cell phone and dialed 911, using whatever my GPS provided coordinates to give me a rough idea of where the curiosity took over. As soon as I hung up the phone, dispatcher, and with the worried I walked up to the man, who was clearly shaken, and his equally upset wife. The woman was unconscious, her arms and face were cut, and her clothing was ripped, as if someone or something had attacked them. Yet there were no important hints of what led to this catastrophe. While awaiting the paramedics to when I got there, I tried talking to the man to find out who or what had done this to them, and he continued to talk ramblingly about something that appeared in the woods, and as he narrated it with trembling lips, he attacked them while they were trying to change their tire. In reality, the supposed monster was enormous, towering over them both earlier. Strangely enough, he was unable to completely prevent the chaos and harm that followed. Describe what it looked like, because it happened so quickly and with so little. After what seemed like an age, the ambulance finally arrived with lights. I shuddered as we saw the medical staff carry them both into their cars for more treatment. At what exactly might have led to such violence, given that assistance had come in time without a lot of commotion from whatever beast attacked them first, which let my mind stray further into given the existence of that terrible creature. The voyage ahead appeared excessively unsettling. I wondered what the true cause of the savagery was. Of this unanswered mystery, as I resumed my journey towards Highway 81, Nebraska, that night. My chest was thumping violently, with fear and anxiety were pervasive in the air, as though they could sense my impending doom. As I proceeded along the barren stretch, with each mile marker that passed, my thoughts kept returning to the hazy account of Highway 81 given by the frantic man attacker. Despite the fact that the image was not very clear, I couldn't get rid of the sense that a duty to discover the truth about this enigmatic entity. 2 days later, I heard a gathering of individuals in Nebraska near a small diner, discussing the recent spate of animal killings in the region, and the gory character of these assaults had a striking similarity to the couple's tale, sending a chill down my spine as I was curious and thought that this might be connected to their attacker. I chose to look into it more and speak with Rick Spencer, a local wildlife specialist. I conveyed my curiosity about where this ferocious predator came from and asked Rick for advice on how to approach it over coffee. And he informed me that he had been detecting indications of an unidentified animal hiding in the surrounding woodlands. While conducting fieldwork, he thought it might be an unidentified species that had been altered by outside influences. Such environmental changes or pollution had chosen to go with Rick, and his next we embarked on an expedition to investigate these unexplored woods. As we were strolling through thick undergrowth early the following morning, I saw paw tracks running deep among tree trunks that took us to a secluded natural cave. As we got closer, Rick signaled that we should proceed with caution while taking out his flashlight from his rucksack. We were positioned inside the cave to discover hair samples in the bones of disfigured. Rick's microscope was used to examine the prey that were dispersed around the damp ground. We found remnants of genetic material that belonged to him back at his temporary laboratory. Our hearts pounded in anticipation as we learned about an unknown animal species. We prepared our next course of action to get a picture of this elusive monster. We installed many motion-activated trail cameras close to its apparent den as a result, before withdrawing to our encampment in anticipation of the beast stalking beyond the darkness's shroud. We gathered the cameras at the crack of dawn and prayed for a breakthrough. Our jaws dropped as we eagerly watched the video in Rick's truck, when on one of the cameras, a huge, hideous monster sprang out of the shadows. The creature had dark matted fur to conceal its roughly 7-foot height. It was muscular, with long claws poised for attack and sharp tusks sticking out of its lips, in keeping with every detail of the nasty predator we had read about. We informed the local authorities and gave them proof that this dangerous animal was present in their area. Nevertheless, they made every attempt to find and capture this hideous beast. It was able to avoid capture time and time again, and the somber silence fell over our reluctantly acknowledging his failure. Rick made the decision to resume his investigation on different wildlife species while I processed my unsuccessful pursuit. But when I returned home, Highway 81, a glimmer of doubt persuaded me that this mysterious creature would reappear sometime, and I made a self-promise to go back and continue the search when the time came for responses that are so firmly ingrained in me.